NRATV with Bill Whittle.
Hi everybody, welcome to Hot Mike. I'm Bill Whittle. Hot Mike was here not 6-7 minutes ago, and then apparently he heard that there's a buy one, get one free sale at Old Navy, so he's gone, but we expect to have him back by tomorrow. We told you a story a little bit last week about a police officer in New York City, a lovely woman named Miosotis Familia. She was sitting in her police car, and somebody walked up to her. They said, describing it in the some of the surveillance video, they said with a purpose. Somebody walked up to her with purpose, shot her in the car, and she died at the hospital. There she is right now. By all accounts, a lovely woman, a family woman, and another police officer doing her job. Today, George Lopez had a comment to make. He posted something on his Instagram, and it was remarkable, I think. Let's have a look at what George Lopez, the comedian, pointed out today. He said, the Trump administration is deporting Latinos to make the streets safer. You want to make the streets safer? Deport the police. Now, I maintain that this tweet, or rather this Instagram of George Lopez looking like his badass self trying to get his street cred back, I maintain that this and the shooting of the police officer are connected, and that's a case I'm going to make for you right now. Folks, law enforcement, respect for law enforcement is something that's learned. Savages and animals don't have law enforcement. It's something that we have to learn. We learn it from our parents, and we also learn it from the pop culture. Leftists, especially Hollywood leftists and those in the news media, want you to believe that the reason there's been this incredible spate of mass shootings is because of all of a sudden the sudden availability of weapons and so-called assault rifles and all the rest. Well, it's just patently false. If you look at America in the 1950s and 60s, you could walk into any hardware store and buy a weapon, just walk out of there with it. You could do it in Walmart. You can do it in some places still in Walmart. There were no background checks. There was none of this stuff. 50, 60 years ago, there was every high school in the country had a shooting club. They usually held it in the basement or out in back of the school. School guns were everywhere. And on the first of these mass shooters at the University of Texas, professors went out to their cars. You heard me. College professors went out to their cars, got their hunting rifles out of the back, and suppressed the shooter while the police went up the stairs. So it's not that the guns have become more prevalent, but something has changed. And what's changed has been our entire attitude towards law enforcement and towards law enforcement personnel. And I can make this case very, very clearly. We're going to come back to George Lopez. But here's some of the things that the pop culture teaches you. Let's look at some of the things that the pop culture told somebody like me when I was growing up. Here's a clip from a show that you may remember. It was probably taped, I want to say, late 60s, early 70s. Here's about 40 seconds of this. Take a look.
In other words, you're a college man. She'd like to have seen you land a job with a little more status attached. Is that it?
I guess that's part of it.
But not all of it. I think maybe I can understand how she feels. And maybe she's right, Culver. It's awkward having a policeman around the house. Friends drop in, a man with a badge answers the door. The temperature drops 20 degrees. You throw a party and a badge gets in the way. All of a sudden, there isn't a straight man in the crowd. Everybody's a comedian. Don't drink too much, somebody says, and the man with the badge will run you in. Or how's it going, Dick Tracy? How many jaywalkers did you pinch today? And then there's always the one who wants to know how many apples you stole. All at once, you lost your first name. You're a cop, a flatfoot, a bull, a dick, John Law. You're the fuzz, the heat, you're poison, you're trouble, you're bad news. They call you everything, but never a policeman.
That, of course, is the legendary Jack Webb on Dragnet. And, of course, he had the show on radio for many, many years before he took it to TV. And, by the way, just a small little trivia event. The guy who he was talking to there is an actor named Kent McCord. And Kent McCord and Martin Milner were on a spin-off show from Dragnet called Adam 12. There's another show I grew up with, learning about police officers and the kind of work they do and the kind of lives they lead and how difficult it can be. So that's what I took in as a kid, and that's what most of you took in as a kid, too, if you were growing up in the 60s and 70s like I was. Let's have a look at something that kids took in when they were growing up in the late 90s. I'm going to show you a piece of Hollywood filmmaking now. The total segment's about 2 minutes. We're not going to watch that much of it. And I want to say two things about this. First thing I want to say is this is some of the best filmmaking I've ever seen. I saw this in a movie theater. I simply couldn't believe my eyes. This is Hollywood at its absolute best in terms of technical ability, in terms of shooting, special effects, editing, music, everything. It's absolutely perfect. It's absolutely magnificent. And it's also a form of pornography. Let's roll this second clip from, I want to say, from 1999. And watch what happens with law enforcement in this clip.
Would you please remove any metallic items you're carrying? Keys, loose change. Holy.
Okay, here it comes. Now watch, because as I said, this is an absolutely incredible piece of filmmaking. Now these are security guards, of course, but obviously they're policemen. They're obviously law enforcement. There's no question about that. And you can see a guy with his little revolver there making a call for help, and what's-her-name, Trinity, just comes up and plain just executes him with a machine pistol of some kind. And now these two anti-heroes, as you can see, are marching into the bank. They casually draw their weapons, and now begins one of the most amazing sequences in the history of film. And I'm not exaggerating here. This gunfight in the lobby of The Matrix, that's this movie, The Matrix, with Keanu Reeves. This lobby sequence is absolutely astonishing. And watching this in the theater as I did, you are you're pardon the expression, blown away by it. It's so exciting. It's so mind-bogglingly intense. And on and on and on it goes. And you watch this, needless to say, you're on Neo's side. You're on the side of Keanu Reeves and so on. You're on the side of the guys in the black coats, for example. But even though the people who they are gunning down are wearing a badge that says police, they are without question a SWAT team. They are without question law enforcement officers. There's no question about it. And here we go again. The super slow motion. We have the gun carousel, we have the cartridges falling to the ground in slow motion, all the things exploding. They're doing reverse somersaults through the air. They're picking weapons off the ground in upside down slow motion. This is violence porn, is what it is. And in the audience watching this, I had no sense of what I was seeing. It's only now, or years later anyway, as I begin to wake up about these things, what I'm actually looking at. What I'm looking at here is I'm looking at the massacre of police officers in such a way that everybody in the audience is 100% behind it, and they think it's just really, really cool. This is what Hollywood has done. This is what's changed, not the presence of guns in America. This is what's changed in America since the days of the 50s and 60s when we didn't have these mass shootings. And by the way, I'm not going to mention their names because it's my policy not to mention the names of murderers whenever I can possibly help it. But the two people that started really the first of these modern mass shootings at Columbine, those two individuals were known as the Black Trench Coat Club. They were heavily influenced by The Matrix, heavily influenced by it. They dressed that way when they went in there to murder those innocent people at Columbine. So don't tell me that this doesn't have an effect. Now, there are free speech issues at work here, and there are all kinds of other issues, but what I'd like to do now is bring in a guest who we've had before, certainly a friend of the NRA, and much more importantly, a friend of law and order and law enforcement in this country, and that, of course, is our friend Sheriff Bill Wayborn from Tarrant County, Texas. Sheriff, it's great to have you back with us. How are you?
Great, Bill. It's good to be with you, sir.
Sheriff, I don't know if you're able to see that clip, but surely you've seen some of it. You've seen what goes on in modern movies. You've seen how this idea of the rise of the anti-hero means that the villains, the people who get gunned down by these cool gangsters, are often law enforcement personnel. When I was a kid, you used to hear this in virtually every show I ever saw, or every movie. You'd hear some version of crime doesn't pay. But that's not the case anymore. You're a sheriff, modern-day sheriff. You look like a sheriff, you sound like a sheriff, and you strike me as the same kind of man that this country's always looked to for law enforcement. Do you feel that the pop culture has changed in such a way that it not only makes your job more difficult, it makes it more dangerous as well?
I absolutely believe that, and I think shows just like you showed right there is doing that. And obviously there are, the video games that kids are watching these days are off value. They are showing that the bad guys win, and the cops are just, it's okay to kill cops. And I agree with you that it makes it, dulls the senses, and it makes it okay to see what happened right in New York with that single mom, and that is something that I've seen that the values have gotten weak and lost.
I think I want to tie this back to George Lopez, because it's not just George Lopez. This is Hollywood and celebrities in Hollywood all the time. But when George Lopez says something like, hey, if you want to make the streets safer, instead of deporting the illegal aliens, why don't we just deport the police? I think that is dehumanizing the police, but more importantly, Sheriff, I think it's delegitimizing the police. Certainly, I'm not in any position to tell you this. I'd love to hear what you have to say about it. But it's kind of common knowledge that a policeman or a sheriff out there in the middle of the city doing his job is protected by his badge, and no one thinks that means that little piece of tin is going to stop a bullet. When you say protected by the badge, they're protected by the reverence and the respect that the citizens are supposed to have for law enforcement. And if George Lopez makes a statement like this, he's essentially weakening that protection. Do you think there's anything to that?
I think you're again spot on, and I think, and quite frankly, I'll be very frank on this. President Obama gave people permission to start doing this kind of thing. He downplayed the police, and he hit the police on several occasions and started this divisive activity. And then you have somebody like George Lopez. It's okay, he thinks, to do this, but I am extremely disappointed and think it's a very foolish thing. The days of Andy Griffin and Adam 12 and Dragnet and all of those wonderful things are gone. Probably the most positive police show that I've seen as of recently, and unfortunately it's not here anymore, but filmed right here in downtown Fort Worth, was Walker, Texas Ranger, and just behind me is the old courthouse that Chuck Norris ran up the steps, and as his brother Aaron filmed him, and that show did more for policing and the positive remarks of policing, and I sure wish people be watching Walker.
Sheriff, I'm so happy you mentioned Andy Griffith, the Andy Griffith Show, because I'd just plain forgotten about that. There was a guy, and people may not think this is very important, but I think this is absolutely critically important. If you grew up watching, the Andy Griffith Show, you realize that Sheriff Taylor was not just a good sheriff, he was a good man, he was a good father, and it was his virtue, it was his personal virtue that made Mayberry into kind of a little rural paradise where there is no crime. And Barney Fife, who's a little bit of a, egotist, obviously, he gets one bullet, he gets to keep it in his shirt pocket just so he doesn't hurt anybody with it. But it was the fundamental goodness of Andy Taylor that kept that town peaceful and safe. And that representation of police officers I haven't seen in 20 years now.
You are absolutely right, and I think that's what we need to be doing. And in real law enforcement, and I'd love to see pop culture bring those type of shows back and reinvent the Matt Dillons that always won and those type of things. But, what I encourage my peer group to do is we've got to be out there and we've got to work hard on building relationships with our community. And sometimes that can be difficult when people like George Lopez divide us.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be back right after this break. We're sitting here talking to an honest-to-God sheriff who knows what's going on, a real sheriff, a good man who's keeping law and order. And I don't know if you've noticed it, but I've certainly noticed that he's wearing a white hat like he's supposed to. We'll be back in just a few moments. This is Hot Mike on NRATV.